Hi.
Talking to them.
Well, welcome to our second month in to front-end development meetup group. So we're glad to see you guys here. Do a quick intro to the organizers. So myself, I'm Christine. So these are the people you can harass if you feel ever so inclined. Uni, our fearless leader, is not here tonight. Satya, you wanna raise your hand? Sangeeta's not here. Kevin is here. And Razib is here somewhere.
He's at the front door.
He might be rounding some people up. So we're your organizers. Let us know if you need anything. So a little shout out to our sponsors. Obviously, Thomson Reuters, you're in the building. They're huge Manning publications. So they actually fund some of our giveaways that we do at the end of the evening. And then we got this really cool one. So has anyone heard of the Squares Conference? Me neither, but I did now. So it's a 3-day Dev and Tech conference that's actually in Grapevine in April, and they've been so gracious to give our feds 15% off tickets with the coupon code below. And then we're also giving away tickets tonight, so it'll be pretty cool. It's a 3-day conference. They have some really good speakers. Ken Taber is speaking. I don't know if anyone has ever heard him speak. Very good speaker. So here are our door prizes. We got 2 $25 Amazon gift cards. Did everybody get a feedback form? I know you didn't, Neha, calm down. Anybody who didn't, we'll get you at the end of the night, okay? 2 ebook vouchers for Manning Publications, and then we have 1 conference ticket this evening. Next month we'll be giving away another one, okay? So on to the reason why you guys are here. So we have Mr. John Lawrimore here. John, you wanna raise your hand? He is a principal consultant and trainer at Improving Enterprises here in Dallas. And he carries over a decade of experience in engineering, particularly strengths in web and Microsoft technologies. And John began working in AngularJS since 2012, and he regularly delivers 4-day training courses targeting at development teams, starting with the new technology. He holds a bachelor's degree in information sciences from UT Arlington and an MBA from UT Dallas. So everybody give me a hand to welcome.
Hello. Is this mic okay? Let's switch PowerPoints here real quick. Perfect, thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm glad to be here. So about this talk, this is about AngularJS performance. So we're going to talk about different things that you can do with your AngularJS application to increase your page speed, the user, the wait time for the user. We're also going to talk about a few things you can do just in general with JavaScript. What we focus on today is all going to be around Angular 1X, so really as of Angular 1.5. There are, of course, a lot of performance enhancements that are coming to 2.0, but that's a whole other conversation. So we're sticking with Angular 1X for today's conversation. Again, about me, I work for Improving Enterprises. I've been doing consulting and training for, yes, I realize the title's different, that actually changed yesterday. I've been doing consulting for TR for over a year, consulting and training. So I do training for, actually I put probably about 150 developers at TR through my Angular training class. I think a few of you have been doing it. I recognize some faces. So, and as said earlier, I've been working with Angular for about 3 or 4 years. And that's pretty much kind of my thing. So .NET guy, but I've really kind of refocused myself to front end. So, talk about performance. So, in any software application, you've got 2 things that really affect your performance. One is the algorithmic time complexity, which is a measure of how many comparisons a program needs to make to achieve a result. Most of the stuff we're going to talk about today is not in that area. Most of what we're going to talk about is space complexity, which is a measure of how much space or memory a computer needs to run your solution. So anything in the JavaScript realm is pretty much going to have to do with that second aspect there. Talking about measuring performance in your application, obviously the first thing you want to do is you want to find bottlenecks in your application, whether that be in your code or in a library, or maybe it's something on the DOM. Raise your hand here if you're familiar with the dev tools in Chrome. Excellent, excellent. So you're probably definitely using it for debugging and looking at elements and modifying CSS. Raise your hand if you use it for performance measuring. Raise your hand if you knew that there was performance measuring. Okay, excellent, excellent. So, of course, there are a lot of add-ons that you can do, but there's a lot of tools that are available to you right there in the installed dev tools without any extensions that you can use. First one is Timeline. So the Timeline panel lets you record and analyze all the activity in your application as it runs. It's also the best way to start an investigation of where you have performance issues. And it's kind of one of those things that it's pretty self-explanatory once you start using it, but it really is a great place to start in terms of your investigating where you've got your bottlenecks in your code. The second place is going to be on the in the events. Here's where you can find, it'll measure the time of every method that runs in your JavaScript code. It gets pretty deep. You can see, for example, here you can see each method that it went through and how long it took. And allows you just to drill down and find your issues. A lot of it, of course, is going to be in the Angular code. You may have to backtrack a little bit to find out what code of yours is causing the Angular code to take so long. But it's a good place to start. Of course, then you have the memory view, which shows you a graph of all the memory that's used in the application. That's pretty helpful as well. And then, of course, you definitely have some extensions that you can add on to your dev tools that are going to help you out a lot. Most of you are probably familiar with the first one I talked about, which is Battering. This is a free, of course, all of them are free, but you can add this onto your Chrome browser, and it has a lot of tools. For some reason, there's two in the Chrome store. One says stable, one doesn't say stable. You want to get the one that says stable, the other one doesn't work and hasn't worked for quite some time. But anyway, this allows you to really inspect and drill down into the scopes in your AngularJS application. You can even kind of highlight all your scopes. You can see all the watches and dependencies for each scope. It's very, very helpful in drilling down and finding anything that's performance related as far as watches. Another watch tool that you can use is Angular Watchers. It's actually very, very simple, but it's also a very, very helpful tool. Essentially, it just tells you at any given time how many watches exist on your page. And as you are flipping through your application, like maybe you click onto a different route, you'll see this number will change. Whereas you're interacting, you may see watches that are closed out, and that number will update itself. That's pretty much all there is to that one, but I use it myself quite a bit. So, obviously watches and the digest are going to be where you have the biggest impact in Angular as far as performance. So, the digest, what is the digest? Give me a kind of raise hand idea if you're familiar with what the digest is. Okay. So, Angular does a lot of magic, right? It's got really good dirty checking and two-way binding. It's one of the things that really sets it apart from other frameworks, right? Is how easy it is to use. So much of it just happens automatically. You don't have to do anything, right? You just use ng-model, and the rest of it does the rest of it happens behind the scenes. You don't have to do anything, right? the way that happens is Angular is in the background creating all of these watches. And the watches are essentially, it's just a way to find a value and then what to do with the value changes. And so in the background, Angular is constantly running what's called the digest. And it's checking all of the watches in the application. Now, some of those may be watches that you created yourself using the $watch, if you've ever used that, right? Most of the watches you did not directly create. They were created because you used some Angular directive or you use a library directive that is creating watches in the background. But essentially, it's this big, long, essentially a dictionary of how to get a value, what the value was before, and what to do if that value changes. And each time the digest runs, it goes through, does a comparison. And that, again, is the biggest performance consideration in Angular, is that digest that's running all the time. So how often does it run? Well, that depends on what's going on. The digest is triggered by all of these things. If a user does something, they key up, click, double click, any of those typical user interactions that we see, which is why if you've ever tried to, say, modify a form element by using jQuery, say you went and changed the text, and the model doesn't update. If you've ever wondered why, that is because the digest didn't run because using jQuery is not going to trigger the digest. It requires an Angular recognized interaction. Setting the text as a field outside of Angular is not recognized as an Angular interaction. So anyway, that's the first thing. Also, any responses from the HTTP service. If you think, when your application is calling out to an API, every time it gets an answer back, it's causing that digest to run. Also, if you're using the Angular's timeout or interval services, probably something happens less often than the first two. And then if you have any manual calls to scope.digest or scope.apply, which is not something you have to do very often, but it is a way that the digest is triggered. This is a way to manually trigger the digest, basically. If you're doing automation, you may have had to deal with that before. So this digest loop, again, it runs anytime it gets triggered, but it doesn't just run once, it actually runs at least twice. It has to make sure that any of those callbacks that it got, so it's got this value of, say, it's user.username. And if it changed, it's going to call a callback or several callbacks, right? Well, there's a chance that one of those callbacks could have changed another value that's being watched. So what the digest has to do is it has to make two full cycles and get the same answer back. And if something changes, then it has to run again because there's potential that it could have changed another value that's being watched. And of course, that will eventually time out, and you may have seen this in your application where, you just, like, if you open up the console in your DevTools and you'll have just error after error after error, it'll say, something about endless loop, Stack Overflow, too many calls to the digest, something along those lines. And that's because it hit that maximum number of times it'll run, which is 10. So if you say you have a watch for username that changes the user's full name, and the user's full name changes the username, and there's a watch on both of them, then that will end up in an endless loop. So watches. Watches are, again, anytime you manually do a scope.watch or watch group or watch collection. Also, anytime you use an expression, almost every time you use an expression, let's say that, which is the curly braces, the double mustaches. If you're using a directive that has binding, there should be watches behind that. Filters, ng repeat. There's a lot of different things. This isn't everything, but this is kind of the normal things that you're going to see. They're going to create watches for you in the background. It's kind of arbitrary number. Does anybody know what Angular says is the most watches you should have per page?
2,000.
What's that?
2,000.
2,000. I don't know where they came up with that. I guess they just had several people interact with the application and ask them how long they thought was too long. I don't know, but they say 2,000 is the max number, which sounds like a lot, but considering the fact that most watches are not created by you, it's created by just the application running, right? And considering repeaters, that's not a hard number to hit. Why repeaters have an impact on that is if you think about, say you've got a grid and it has 50 records in it, right? And inside there you've got 5 columns, right? Well, that's 5 times 50, that's how many watches you're gonna end up with, right? So that's, you're already just one grid, you got 250 watches right there at least. Adds up pretty quickly. So, things that you can do to limit the impact of the digest in those watches. Well, here are kind of 7 or 8 kind of general things, and we'll kind of go through each one and discuss some of the things you can do that fall under each one of these categories. Limit the number and the size of the watches, of the watch instances, so that's dealing with repeaters specifically. Limit the use of directed binding. Bind without a watch when possible. Then watches after work is done. Consolidate watches. Avoid unnecessary watch callbacks. Minimize work performed in watch callbacks, and limit triggers to the digest. So these are the basic things that kind of all the things we're going to talk about dealing with the digest is going to fall under one of these points. So when you're dealing with ng repeat, obviously, just minimizing the use, that's going to have a big impact, right? Use it as little as possible, but obviously, you probably have, if you're implementing it, you have a feature that needs it. So when you do use it, you want to reduce the number of records that you're showing. Ways to do that is to implement infinite scrolling, infinite pagination, chunking, any of those type of practices. You only want to pull the number of records that you can display at one time, and maybe a little bit of buffer, right? And also retrieve only the properties that is needed, the properties model that's needed for this particular display, this particular view. Say, for example, you're showing a list of items. Typically in a list, you're not showing every property of that item. Now, if you go into view more details, then you're probably going to show more information. You want to size your payload for what you're going to display. If it's got, a created date or anything like that, and you're not displaying it, don't pull it back. So, directional binding. One of the very common things that I see. Is everybody in here familiar with making your custom directives? Okay. On the scope property, right, when you're linking your properties of scope to your attributes of the declaring element, you have to specify the binding, right? So you have 3 options. You've got the equal sign, you've got the ampersand, and you've got the $. Equal sign is for two-way binding. That is highly overused. It's only necessary if your directive has a need to change the value. So if you think like a form element, right? The reason why it's so overused is because a lot of times developers think that you have to set up that binding in order to have something be dynamic. Okay, well, I want to be able to specify that in my controller, or it's going to come from the service, or whatever it has, it's potentially going to change. I'm not going to hard code that on the attribute, so I need binding. You don't need binding. The declaring element can achieve the binding on its own if it needs to, one-way binding, by using an expression. If you think, for example, if you have, say you have an image, and you're just using just a regular image tag, you're not using a directive, you're just doing the src attribute, right? Well, you can put that in curly braces, and it can come from the surface. So that right there, you're achieving a dynamic. You're populating it dynamically by using an expression. Well, you can do that on a directive attribute as well by using the @ sign, and there's no binding that's set up for it. There would be binding set up if they use the expression, but it's one-way binding rather than two-way binding. So binding without a watch when possible. So in Angular 1.3, they introduced this really cool feature called bind once. Now, bind once was actually a third-party library that was so cool that in Angular 1.3 they actually pulled it into Angular as it was, used the same name, the same way of declaring it and everything. And the way it works is you just put this double colon. Now that only works in expression. I wish it worked with attributes, but it doesn't. But what that does is it's a way to say, I want this to be bound, but there's no need to create a watch. I actually think it would have been better. The better implementation would have been to do it in reverse, to say, it should be assumed one way, or bind once unless I put a colon, because I find that more often than not, you don't need a watch, you just need binding. But every time you use this here, you'll notice your watch, if you have that watchers thing open I was telling you about in the DevTools, you'll see it go down once per item and repeater every time you use the double colon. So a lot of times when you create a watch, it's something you only need to do once. Kind of think of the difference between the timeout and interval service, right? One does it once and the other one just keeps on doing it. Well, a watch by default is going to continue to run every time a value changes. There is a way that you can stop a watch, and that is by calling what is returned from $watch. Now, if you're doing that inside your method, you actually have to set it to a variable like this, and then you set it equal to the $watch, right? And that, again, what gets returned, if you call it, it will end the watch. And if you look through your applications, you'll probably find a lot of opportunity to do this. Consolidating watches. So there's a couple ways to consolidate watches. One way is if you are inside your JavaScript, you're creating a watch. Typically, so take the example, maybe you need to do something if on this user form, right? So edit user form. If the username changes or the password changes, you've got some logic you need to perform. Well, the way I typically see people implement it either gets implemented as two different watches that are set up with performing the same action as the callback, or they just watch user and then check to see if the username or the password changed, which is equally as a bad way to implement that. You can use what's called watch group, and you can pass it in an array, and it will handle that as one watch, which is going to be better for performance on your application. It's also easier to manage, so that way you don't have two functions, or it's drier. I guess is a good way to say that. If you're not familiar, there's actually a couple different. You've got watch group and watch collection, and there's if you ever are in a situation where you're not, has nothing to do with performance, but if you're ever in a situation where watches aren't being triggering, it's probably because you're using the wrong one, or you're not using deep watch, which is yet a fourth way of setting up a watch. It's another conversation though. Another way to consolidate is by using the ng switch in your markup instead of ng show or ng hide. So a lot of times what you find is you've got, think of like a, maybe like a wizard view. Maybe you've got several divs, and depending on what step they're on, one of these divs is going to be displayed. So each one of them will say, ng show if status or step equals 1 or step equals 2, whatever it may be. Using ng switch is a cleaner way to do it, and it's also going to have a positive impact performance-wise. So you give say ng switch whatever you're switching on, then you have the different wins, and then you can provide it a default view. And if you're dealing with validation messages and you're using the ng messages module, they have the exact same sort of thing here in ng messages. It's ng message, and then you can use like the ng message win, or I can't remember, it may not be ng message win, but it's the same sort of setup that you can do for validation messages as well. So a minute ago I was talking about watch group. I mentioned, watching user when you really only need to be watching username. Well, that causes unnecessary callbacks. You always want to set your watch to the most precise thing you can. If you only care about the user ID changing, don't watch user ID. And that will reduce the amount of times it reduces the amount of work that Angular's having to do in the background. So we're talking about reducing the amount of work performed. This is something that's very handy, does have a very positive impact on performance, and I almost never see this implemented unless you have to. When I see people use track by, it's when you have to because you've got duplicates in your repeater. If anybody's ever dealt with that, and you'll get the error. It'll say, if you click on it, go to the Angular's website. It'll tell you to use track by $index. What the track by is for is to tell Angular how to identify this object. And if it's not specified, then it's going to use the entire object to identify the object. Obviously, it's going to be lighter for Angular to just track a number or some sort of field off of that object than it would be the entire object. So you should actually use track by in every repeater that you have. You just say item and items, track by item dot whatever the property is. Also, when it comes to workload, I do see this a lot, and it has a pretty big impact on performance, and that is using functions in your markup. It's something you never want to do, and I do understand that sometimes you have the need to display the result of a function in your markup, and the way you'd want to do that is to, inside your controller, run the function and then set that value, what it returns, set that to a variable on scope, so that way every time the digest is running, it's not constantly calling this function. And if you actually have a reason that you want a function to be called every digest cycle, you probably, it sounds like there's something wrong with your design. So, similarly, filters. So that is another example of functions that run every time the digest runs. And again, it's not just running once, it's running at least twice, because the digest has to run at least twice each time. So you want to use filters sparingly. One thing you can do to make the filters a little bit more efficient, the very first line of code in your filter should be an early exit. a lot of times there's nothing to do. Maybe if the list is empty, or who knows, maybe some property's not set. There's always usually some circumstance where the filter doesn't have anything to do, in which case you want to do an early exit before you start declaring variables and creating any extra overhead. Another thing you can do when you have a complex situation, multiple filters, whatever it may be, and I'm normally not an advocate for this because filtering is very much a role. It's very much a presentation role. It's something that should be. It makes sense for it to be in the view. It makes less sense for it to be in the controller because it's not a role of the controller. But sometimes for performance, it makes sense. In which case, what you can do is you can, inside your controller, have a dependency on the filter service, and you can call $filter, and you give it the name of the filter you want to call. You give it the array, and then any other arguments that you need to pass it. Sometimes you sacrifice for performance. So, and I will say too that Angular in 1.5 and especially in 2.0, what they talked about filters, so much has changed that they've made a lot of performance-related changes around filters, but you still have to be careful, in current and future versions. So when it comes to limiting triggers to the digest, this is another feature that was added in Angular 1.3. It's called ng model options, and you only have, on the options right now, there's only two properties. One of them is update on, and the other one is debounce. Update on can be useful in a couple ways. One, let's say you have a situation where you need to validate a username, and you're going to call back to service to make sure the username is unique. You probably don't want to be doing calls to your API on every keystroke, right? And by default, that's what happens. The default event for a form field is it's either key up or key down. I can't remember which one it is, but same difference. It's every keystroke. So by using the update on here, you can set it to update on blur, and the digest will not run until the user blurs away from that field. Very helpful. Another thing you can do with ng model options is set debounce. And debounce, when you use debounce, you probably also want to use update on. And the reason why is because you can set a different debounce for each event. And what debounce is it's a way to kind of throttle or to say, within 500 milliseconds, I don't care how many times this event occurs, I only want the digest to run one time. Well, you probably want that value to be different for key up and blur. Reason being that you don't want any delay on blur, right? So you don't mind have a little bit of delay and how long, when it triggers the digest cycle as they're typing, but as soon as they move away from that field, it's time to do whatever updates need to happen. So that's why you would generally want to use debounce with the update on. And the reason why this says default, by the way, default translates to either key up or key down. I can't remember which one it is. And obviously, ng model option only works if you have ng model. But so similar to the debounce feature, you get the same sort of thing for HTTP calls. Remember, I mentioned that HTTP responses is one of the things that will trigger the digest cycle. If you think about as you're loading an application, if you have a well-designed application, you're probably not getting all of your data back in one call to the API. You're probably doing a call out to a user service, you're doing a call out to this data service and that data service. I mean, you probably have 4 or 5, maybe even 10 separate calls going on all at the same time to your API. and you don't need all 10 of them responding back at the same time and causing a digest cycle. So what you can do is you can, inside your app config, you can set your config block of your module. You can have a dependency on the HTTP provider and call use apply async. I don't know why it's called that, but that's what they named it. And you can either give it true, which will use a default number, or you can pass it a number of milliseconds that you want to say, however many calls responses happen within this set amount of time only counts as one hit to the digest. So very, very similar to the debounce feature. So those are the digest and watch related optimizations. But there's a lot of them. But again, that's going to be where you see the biggest impact on performance of your Angular application, is keeping control of that. Other things you want to consider. Everybody familiar with DOM? What the DOM is? And it's your document. It's essentially, it's all of all your elements on the page, right? Well, you've got the JavaScript, and you have the JavaScript engine, and you have the DOM. They're two separate things, and every time there's any sort of communication between the two, there's going to be an impact on performance. It's actually very, very expensive. And just in terms of front-end applications as a whole, that's where you see your biggest impacts on performance, because of interactions between the JavaScript engine and the DOM. Well, Angular kind of removes most of that, okay? Because Angular's entire design moves away from that. If you compare it to something like jQuery, right? jQuery is just all about, we're going to interact with the DOM directly. We're going to interact with the DOM directly. Whereas Angular, you're interacting with the model, and it's doing, we'd be here for a while if I explained how all that works under the covers, but it gets you away from that if you don't abuse it. One of the things you see so often, I see it all the time, is developers solving problems in an Angular application with DOM interaction. Using jQuery, I see it all the time. And that usually falls back on just a design. It's a design issue. Knowing how to solve a problem using what Angular provides you. If you are doing selection of elements on your page and doing manipulation inside your Angular application, you may want to rethink the problem. How can I solve this a different way? If there's absolutely no way to solve that problem using Angular, which I have seen a few examples of that, you want to make sure that you're doing it in the right place, and that's through the link or compile methods of a directive. Those are the only places that should ever exist if you are using any sort of DOM manipulation.
So you were saying that the script file should be just the loader page eventually?
It should be what?
All the scripts should be initiated just after all the code should be there at the end of the page.
Well, there's that too. I mean, that's definitely a performance impact of having your JavaScript at the bottom of the page, but that's not necessarily what this is talking about. So this is just talking about not using things like jQuery. Okay, jQuery is quickly becoming it's slowly becoming a fossil, right? Because its entire approach is inefficient. The entire approach, what's designed around the whole idea. Angular provides you a way to avoid DOM manipulation because it's so costly. So it's just a matter of solving problems through Angular and not through selecting an element on your page and doing manipulation. Another performance impact is keeping your scopes lightweight. So just like anything else in JavaScript, your scope is a JavaScript object that's being persisted. And there's a lot of scopes, right? Actually, every element on the page has some scope of some kind. It's within your ng app, right? It's either a it's either an inherited scope or it's an isolated scope. Could be from a parent controller, could be a directive of its own. But there's scope all over the place. You want to keep those as lightweight as possible. You want to isolate them as whenever possible to keep them lighter, right? Because if you don't need access to all these parent properties, if you don't need to be inheriting those, don't. On your directive, you can actually just set scope to true, and it will give you an isolated scope, even when you don't have a need to link them to attributes, right? Because that's normally how you use that scope property, is you're doing linking of your properties on scope to some attribute. If you don't have a need for that, you can just set scope to true, and it'll give you an isolated scope. You also want to avoid using root scope whenever possible, because root scope is what every scope is created from, right? So the heavier root scope is, the heavier every scope in your application is going to be. And of course, there are some needs to put things on root scope. I do it, but I only do it in a case that it is something that is, I guess it's kind of like a 90-10 or 80-20 rule. You know, if you need it most of the time, then it may make sense to put it on a root scope. If you're only using it for if it's only needed for a small percentage of the time, find a different way. Find a different way to get that information or get that functionality rather than putting it on a root scope. A lot of times, scope is used as a way to communicate across your application, and it's not the most efficient way. Angular does put in functionality to communicate from scope to scope. You probably have used this yourself. You have emit and broadcast. The biggest problem with this is nothing to do with performance. The biggest problem with this is it has a dependency on hierarchy of scope. A lot of times, I would say more often than not, when I'm needing to do some sort of broadcast, it's not a parent scope, it's a cousin scope, or it's far away. So what everybody ends up doing is they end up going straight to root scope, and so they say root scope.broadcast and broadcast this message. It's heavy, it's expensive. And it's not the way that controllers should be communicating with each other. Yes, it works, but it's inefficient, and I personally think it's a bad design because that's not what scope is designed for. So a better way to communicate between controllers, because really that's what you're trying to do. It's really not about communicating between scope. It's about communicating between controllers. To say, for example, hey. Item list, I'm the item editor, and this item was just edited, so you need to now get a new copy. That would be an example, right? Has nothing to do with scope. So what you can do instead is to create an event hub. And if you Google, you'll probably find examples of this. An event hub is simply just a service that you create that allows you to subscribe to a named event, just like on the broadcast and emit, and give it a callback, and then something has the ability to broadcast to that event hub by name and give it, maybe the object that changed or whatever it may be, and that event hub will then call back it will run all of the callbacks it was given for that name event. Essentially, it's doing the exact same thing, but it's removing that away from scope. Leveraging caching. So oftentimes I see in an application where if you go to the network tab and you'll see the same call being made from multiple controllers, right? Get an item, like say for example, that piece where maybe an item changed, and the viewer controller needs it, and the list controller needs it, and something else may need it. What you can do is you can set the HTTP service to cache that result, and if there's any subsequent calls that have the same parameters, same URL and everything, it will give back the same answer that it got the first time. Those are stored in the cache factory. And you do have the ability to remove those at any time. What that looks like is this. So you're saying HTTP GET, whatever is your normal thing. This is the normal config you do with an HTTP request. But you just say cache true. And this is per call, right? So each time you make a call out, you can say cache this result. And if it's in cache, it'll update the cache that it has. And if you need to end it, the way you can do is you can have a dependency on cache factory, do a get, and then remove from using that same key. Do a remove of the cache that it has, so that way you get an updated copy. So another thing you want to do is avoid repetitive work. And one way you could do that is through the use of compile. So compile is a method that runs one time per occurrence or declaration of a directive versus per instance. So if you compare that to the link method or post link, pre link, depending on which one of these you're talking about, the link method runs per instance. So if you have foo here, if you have foo declared twice in the page, foo directive, and once has a repeater, and there's 5 items in that repeater, you've got 6 instances, but you have 2 declarations, right? A lot of times you have work that only needs to be done once per declaration, such as validation, setting default values. Maybe you've got a really dynamic situation and you need to, set the template. It could be a lot of different things. You can do that using compile, and that will reduce the amount of time. It'll prevent it from running, that work from being performed for every instance, which is what you would see by doing it in a controller or a link or in a template function, something like that. Another consideration is third-party libraries. So you want to make sure that in your application, and this is not Angular specific, but any application, you want to make sure that you're using reputable libraries from reputable sources. Make sure that, the great thing about JavaScript is you can pop open that library and look at it and see how it's implemented, what are they doing. Is there too much? Is it too heavy for what I need? Or go through and grade it, unless it's something that's like a very popular library that people have rated it on performance. You also want to make sure that you're using libraries that are either already made for Angular, or you want to do some sort of wrapping yourself into Angular. So if you're talking about for like Moment, which is a time library, right, or underscore, or Lodash, any of those libraries, they all have an Angular version that wraps that functionality into services and directives and filters and things like that, so it can be used properly in an Angular application, with an Angular application. So make sure that you're using those versions or doing some sort of wrapping yourself. Dealing with production, going to production, a couple of considerations. One is to turn off Angular's debugging, and I bet if you look at most applications or production, Angular debugging is turned on because it's on by default. You actually have to turn that off yourself in the config block with using the compile provider, but you say debug info enabled, set it to false. Now, one consideration with that is that when you have an exception, you obviously want, you want that stack trace, you want that information, so whatever handling you have for errors, you can still do. And the way you do that is when you subscribe to the error event, there's a property there called reload with debug info, and it will basically temporarily turn debugging back on, run that exception again, so that it is able to get all of that debug information. Another performance consideration is to use template cache. Now this is something you want to have. You want to do this through automation. It's not something you want to handle yourself. That would be a maintenance nightmare. But so template cache is a way for Angular to prevent making multiple calls for the same HTML partial or template, right? So for example, you have an item in a repeater and it's got a directive with a template. It'll do a request one time, and then after that it'll get it from template cache. Well, what you can do is you can go ahead and in the run block, you can build the template cache yourself, so that way Angular never has to even make the first call. Again, do it with automation, but whatever the URL is for that template, that's the key, and then it's minimized HTML as the second argument, and that will make a pretty big performance impact. And even really, this is something that you can do even in your development environment through automation. You don't need to remove your HTML templates, right? You can still keep them there, but you've got Grunt, or you can do it with web optimization. You can do it through Gulp. There's lots of tools out there to do this, but it'll just basically, you've got one file that's generated, and it has a run block, and for every HTML file in the application, it has a line that looks like this. We are about 5 minutes left, so probably a good time to break off for some Q&A. So I'll open the floor to questions.
Yes? When it comes to use apply AC, and you set a time of, let's say, 1,000 milliseconds, does that imply that the response has to wait at least that amount before you get back your response?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't affect the response. Your controller can still do whatever work it's doing, but the UI will take that long to update from the time of the first call or the first response that comes back.
Okay,
But if you have 5 responses within that 1,000 milliseconds, after the 1,000 milliseconds is up, it's going to do one run of the digest, or one hit trigger to the digest.
I see. So just to confirm, if you only have one API call in your controller, and then you set it to 1,000 milliseconds, that means that it's going to feel 1 second
Yes.
slower to the user.
Yes, it is going to cause that delay just in terms of the view updating. So any work that, say, like you've got work that the controller needs to do, when you get that answer back from the API, there's no delay there, just with the view. Yes?
You mentioned not to bind to any functions, but like in ng clicks, that's usually what you do. You bind to a function with no
So I'm talking about with an expression. So it's so a lot of times what you'll see is somebody will create an expression in their markup and then put a function inside of that. When you, in the example of putting in an ng click, that function will only run on the click event, right? But if you put in an expression, it's going to run every digest cycle.
So you mentioned also to use ng switch versus ngifs, but I didn't understand why.
Well, and correct that. So ngIf does something a little different than ngShow. So it's not necessarily always a replacement for ngIf.
We're both of them. You said use ng switch over both of those, right?
Over show and hide.
Yeah.
So show and hide essentially do the same thing in the background, only it's just either going to show or hide, right? But the logic is the same. But using the ng switch, this would be in cases where you have, say, 5 divs, or 2 divs, really just 2 divs, that have a show or hide based on the same value being watched, right? But maybe one of them is going to show if the value equals A, and the other one's going to show if the value equals B, right? That's a case that you would want to use in G-Switch. Any other questions? Yes.
Is this going to be online anywhere, the presentation?
Yes, it will be.
Yes.
So you are going to put your slides on the
Yes, the slides are recorded with the presentation, so that'll all be included. Yes.
I have a question regarding ng repeat. You said about track by specific ID. Is that only valid for unique values? If you have two records with the same value for the ID, is it going to pull only one record or is it going to pull everything?
That will throw an error. They have to be unique. Yeah, so if they're not unique, your only choice is to track by $sign index. But hopefully, you don't have duplicate IDs in your computer. Right? Yes.
Like you just expand on the track by ID. Can I do compound fields? Let's say I've got a compound ID, unique key, or compound key.
Don't think so. But what you could do, is you could, in your controller, you could loop through. Of course, now you may be causing enough performance impact that it's not worth it. But you could create a new property inside your controller that does that combining. But I don't believe that there's a way to do that with the track by. It's got to
You see where I was going with that, because that could be a great example of where that ID could be duplicated.
Right.
Compound key.
Yeah, it's got to be unique. Yes.
Can you think of a reason why track by $index isn't the default? If it is.
I've asked myself that question so many times. I don't know. Anything else? Any other questions?
Is there any place in Angular where you can add hooks to instrument the application and see how many times the digest cycle gets invoked?
How many times what?
The digest cycle gets invoked.
No, not that I know of. That would be nice. The number would be extraordinary. It would be a very high number. A great way to tell is to have a filter on your page, and inside your filter block, just write to the console, I ran X times, and have like a little counter. In fact, anybody who's been to my class has probably experienced that. That's one of the things that we do in there is watch how many times the digest runs using a filter. Any other last question? All right. Well, I'm going to turn this back over to our organizers. Thank you very much.
All right, guys, so we are going to do the giveaway portion. Do we have actual tickets?